afternoon, good morning, everyone. This is Jan Senzimir speaking to you from Arizona, so it's a truly international webinar. We're very, very lucky to have Shane McGuinness, who has been leading a sister project to MERLIN, the WaterLANDS, which has been restoring wetlands in 6 sites across Europe, and is going to introduce us to that project today. My job is simply to help field the questions. Please, if you have questions at any time, you can put it in the chat. And then when the question period happens, I will call on you in turn. And I hope that you will also, we can follow up after the webinar with questions if you'd like. So without further ado, Shane, thank you so much for being with us, especially Easter holiday. We very much appreciate it. I'm sorry, one more thing. We have normally about 20 to 30 minutes of a presentation, sometimes runs to 40. And after that, for the hour, we have a question period. Anyway, Shane, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much, Jan, and lovely to see you again. And thanks very much for everybody for finding the time. It was easy for me to find the time. There's no holiday for me this week, unfortunately. As Jan said, I'm here to present on the progress of the WaterLANDS project. I'll give a brief introduction to what the project is, and then also go through some of our specific action sites or restoration sites, and focus on some of the progress within the catchments of those, but not just in terms of area, but also in terms of science, community, governance, and finance. I'll then talk a bit more broadly about some other interesting elements of the project and how potentially some of your own projects can feed into this as well. There's no point in working in isolation or indeed in silos, attempting to do what we're all aiming towards. I'll move on. It will let me. There we go. So as a brief overview, WaterLANDS is water-based solutions for carbon storage, people, and wilderness. Fit into a nice, simple acronym. It's a 5-year project funded by the Horizon 2020 Green Deal call. Has been running since December 21 and will run for another 40 months, I guess, up until November 2026. It's coordinated by myself and Craig Bullock in University College Dublin through predominantly the School of Architecture, Planning and Environmental Policy. I'm also based in the School of Geography there. We have 32 partners from 14 countries, and as Jan had said, we are a sister project across the other 3, MERLIN obviously, and also West Coast and Superb. Importantly, I suppose, with both your own project in MERLIN and ours and WaterLANDS and others, it is a very large project. We have 32 partners, and ordinarily in the past, many of these, or predominantly these would have been academic institutions or research institutions. However, our project increasingly focuses beyond the ivory towers. It goes for community groups, for semi-state organizations, for state actors, whether that be local authority or national, also international and national NGOs, to ensure that we're not simply providing research and information, but that we are, as our project is designed, an innovation action. We are doing work on the ground. And if that needs science to support it, so be it. But the ultimate goal is restoration, tangible work. Not restoration. Yes, it is an objective. So 10,500 hectares of wetland restoration restored by 2026. We are committed to initiate all of this action sites by 2024, which we have achieved actually by November gone. So we're a little bit ahead. Importantly, however, the definition of restoration within this is not simply around improving the condition and function ecologically speaking, which is of course important, especially with wetlands, but it's also equally about establishing and maintaining supportive governance, policy and strategy, whether that be local, transnational or international, ensuring that healthy communities are both involved in the decision making, in the management and in the eventual potentially work on the ground. And but also, quite key to this, is that it is supported by long-term finance to ensure that all of these wheels are effectively greased. Because as much as I would love to live in a socialist utopia where things are done for moral imperative, ultimately speaking, we need to work in the existing capitalist structures that we reside. Also, as you will imagine, this feeds directly into legislative obligations. Now, I wouldn't have had question marks beside the NRL there. However, the nature restoration law is somewhat under threat at the moment, despite our own sister project pressure towards that, largely led by Sebastian and Daniel in MERLIN. What we're aiming for is not exactly lacking in ambition, it's transformational change. Now, we are cognizant of the fact that establishing transformational change in a 5-year project is potentially a little too ambitious. Not that we burk or shirk our obligations towards ambition, but what we're aiming for, I suppose, is to establish a trajectory towards transformational change. And I think that's probably the best way of framing it. The way of doing this, like I said before, our restoration is not simply based on ecology, although it is supported by that. What we're looking to do is genuinely integrate the knowledge across 4 different key areas. The first is ecology, in other words, restoring services. The second, governance, so community, engaging with those communities. The third is governance and aligning with existing governance structures or potentially even proposing new structures. And then also finance and mobilizing blended finance in particular to support all of this. The idea being that we co-create a new paradigm for restoration. So it's not business as usual, and it's quite a challenge in our project, in fact, to push back against that business as usual. It's also to foster scalability beyond our network. So not simply look at that 10,500 hectares, because frankly, our quite large budget is still a drop in the ocean in terms of wetland restoration, where multi-billion euro is required to do even a small proportion of that. And then also, as you would imagine, catalyze blended finance to support that as well. The whole purpose of this is to build legacy. So we go through 3 stages of WaterLANDS. The first is knowledge, the second is action, and the third is legacy. This is our site map. On this map here, we have 15 knowledge sites in the dark blue. You can have a look at them there, spread quite well geographically. Take the knowledge of these sites and feed it into our 6 restoration sites or action sites in the pink. And the whole point of these is to ensure that we're not reinventing any wheels. We're building on previous legacy, I suppose, and ensuring that we are passing that legacy on beyond the 5-year lifespan of this project. As many of you will be aware, all projects have a defined death date, which is rather frustrating, especially when you build capacity, you establish systems, and then you know exactly when all of that is going to stop. And the website might last a year longer. We're trying to aim to ensure that all of those wheels continue turning within a different acronym, perhaps, certainly within different funding structures, but nevertheless, the work is continued. What I'll do briefly is go through our 6 restoration sites in turn, and then I'll focus specifically on some of the progress we're making in our individual pillars of knowledge. The first restoration site or action site, the term we'll be using from here on, is the Culca Aniran SAC, Special Area of Conservation in Ireland. This one was a challenge to get over the line, largely because the aim of restoration here is not simply to go in with diggers or shovels and block drains, given that it's a upland blanket bog system. And although most of that is very, very helpful in this situation, given the fact that the land tenure or certainly ownership of this area is hazy and very mixed, presuming that we can go in and take large actions across a large site simply won't work. So what we're aiming for here is a results-based payment system using existing farmers on the ground, engaging with those and positively incentivizing behavior change. That could be reducing the number of sheep on a land. It could be fencing off water courses, as the picture here. It could be certainly blocking drains and taking physical actions as they would be. However, what we don't want to do is design a simple, bespoke, results-based payment system that is unique to this area, because there is limited scalability to that. So one of the key elements that we were hoping would come through, and actually did come through before the project began, was integration of a results-based payment scheme into our Common Agricultural Policy Strategic Plan for Ireland, our CAP strategic plan. And that was a real game changer, because that allows the learning that we have gained and continue to gain from this site through the tangible restoration and the engagement with community members can potentially be scaled at a national level, which is really, really important. Ireland is actually very good at results-based payment schemes, given the strength of our farming lobby and the fact that our land is very, very fragmented. Um, Traditional top-down restoration tends not to work very effectively, or certainly cost-effectively. However, our experience over the last 20 years on results-based payments has shown that it can be done. It does yield tangible environmental benefits without having massive social impact. In fact, if done correctly, it should have positive social uplift. So that's Ireland. I could speak about all of these in great detail, but I'll just skim for the moment. The second one is in Northern England, and it's linked to an existing program called the Integrated Catchment Solutions Program, ICASP, of the University of Leeds. And largely speaking, it's now looking at the Great North Bog, which is a collection of numerous different peatland partnerships in the north of England, covering hundreds of thousands of hectares of largely degraded upland blanket bog, as you can see in the photo here. And the focus of this project is not necessarily around the peat or the carbon or all the other ecosystem services. It's looking at one specific ecosystem service, which is the water. Some of the cities in Northern England are hugely dependent on water deriving from peat catchments. In fact, Leeds in the north of England is one of the most dependent cities globally on peat catchments. So in that case, we're now engaging with local water utilities, some of which are privatized, some of which own a lot of this land, to show that there is tangible incentivization to peatland restoration that can yield returns. Again, can talk about this for a long time. The Great North Bog, ironically, is strengthening day by day, whereas in the past it was 6 quite separate projects, all with separate funding models and leadership structures. What we are helping to do through the University of Leeds and various other partners there, including Natural England and the IUCN UK's Peatland programme, is to ensure that there is a cohesive singular vision for this large area, which is ambitious for sure, but certainly not unattainable. The third site is the Netherlands. It's the Eems-Dollard or Eems-Dollard estuary, as you can see in the map on the right. And this is very, very different. It's hard engineering, straight edges, tall dikes keeping the sea out. Quite artificial. I mean, most of this, if not all of this, would have been below sea level at certain times in the past. So it's a challenge because we are dealing with a purely anthropogenic system. However, much of this edge, I suppose, is now naturalizing again. The benefits of having softer edges are now being realized. So instead of tall single dikes, we're now looking at either a combination of 2, so double or twin dikes, or wide green dikes that are much softer, that soak up the energy of rising sea level. They do take up more land, granted, but overall it is both less costly, more resilient, and more environmentally friendly, certainly nature friendly. The challenge there is the farmland you can see in this photo. So much of it is still highly productive, although a lot of it is sinking and a lot of it is salinating as well. So challenges there too. And therefore there is a really, really strong imperative to engage with communities in a respectful manner. Now we engage through the province, our province Groningen, and they have currently they're halfway through a public engagement process, which is yielding really strong support for what we're proposing here, largely because we have framed it in economic terms. We've shown that there is tangible returns based on this, both from an individual farmer level, but also from larger international trade, because the Eems River is still a very important navigable waterway. And one of the biggest challenges of this estuary is siltation. So aligned to this, one of the actions we're taking here not only is to soften the edges, but is also to create what are called natural silt traps in the farmland, ostensibly wetlands, to slow the flow of incoming water, and to allow that sediment to fall out before it hits the estuary itself. Now, massive engagement required for that, but there are tangible benefits, both in terms of raising the sea level and also capturing that sediment and that nutrition before it gets washed to sea. Our fourth site in Estonia, and it is the Pärnu catchment. Very large catchment, quite a flat area, and we've got 3 different organizations involved in the restoration and 3 different land ownerships. So red, yellow, and green circles there represent the three different natures. One is a post-peat extraction site aligned with a company called Tutsi Turvas, whose name I've likely butchered. Very large area, pan flat almost, post-peat extraction, so quite a moonscape in appearance, but therefore reasonably easy to restore. And the economic imperative for doing so, if you can get correct, can scale up across the whole of Estonia, really. The second is the ORMK, the Estonian State Forestry Management Centre. Again, forestry extremely important in Estonia, so threatening that industry is a sensitive issue. So ensuring that we can demonstrate positive economic imperative to do exactly that, or certainly no net loss of your income. And that's proved to be a little bit tricky because if you do re-wet non-productive forestry, there may be an impact on other forestry, on drier land. Now, not always, and we need to ensure that we are objectively communicating the impact or lack of impact before it is simply presumed. And then the final site is within the ownership and management of the Estonian Fund for Nature, which is a little bit easier. So environmental NGO. And that really gives us an opportunity to not only continue the restoration work that's already being done there, but engage with communities along its margins and ensure that we're building that legacy across generations. And I'll touch on that a little bit later on. Science, of course, supported by the University of Tartu. Our fifth site is in Italy, the Venice Lagoon, if you've ever heard of it. And you can imagine that it is quite strongly juxtaposed between what you can see in the image on the right there, quite a healthy wetland bordering one of the most tourist-heavy cities in the world, or locations in the world. So it provides its own challenges in terms of the economic imperative for tourism and the revenue that it generates, but also the erosion of both the wetlands and of the communities, both within the city and nearby it. And that's a big challenge because you're appealing to people who don't necessarily gain from the tourism, but are definitely losing from its activity, whether it's dredging the wetland, whether it's channelization of it, whether it's simple erosion from the large ships moving through it on the wash. So part of this is engagement in a softer way. It's having a coffee across the palazzo with the mayor. It's engaging with farmers on a boat. It's bringing those in shiny shoes out to the wetland and getting them a little bit muddy. And again, you're embedding that legacy across both socioeconomic divides, but also physical geographical divides, which is very important. So for this purpose, we've engaged the fantastic services of a local NGO called We Are Here Venice. Very socially engaged, very artistically engaged, which again, I'll touch on a little bit later. A steep learning curve in terms of restoration, but they have taken to it like ducks to water. So at the bottom image there, you can see the installation of some of our core bales in this area to try and reduce the wash against these currently bare sediment flats. And the last site, before I get into the detail of some of the other work, is in Bulgaria, and it's the Dragoman Marsh, and it's embedded within a larger Dragoman Marsh karst complex. So on the left, you can see what is clearly a wetland. It's wet, it's a large lake. Now it is over-vegetated, and that's one of the issues. However, the biggest issue is on the right, because this is the land ownership of what is still a lake, but on a map and legally speaking, it is a very complicated chessboard of ownership, use and non-use, some of which is very unclear, as murky as the water that it somehow divides. And that's a big challenge because it is not designated as a wetland. And therefore, it is not protected under any Water Framework Directive obligation or others. So one of our key governance challenges here is to ensure that this, what is clearly a wetland, is actually recognized as a wetland and not as productive farmland with a checkerboard ownership issue. And then the other part of that is that if it is recognized as a wetland and if it does fall under the remit of various environmental obligations and directives, then funding can be mobilized, whether it's through recovery and resilience, whether it's through cost of compliance to those directives, or other sources of a blended nature. So that, I suppose, outlines some of the quite particular governance challenges of Bulgaria that can actually be applied elsewhere. For example, in Ireland, where we have quite hazy tenure and commonage or turbary right conditions, some of which are simply not known. We don't know where the map is, let alone where the line on the map is. So this is a really interesting one. Also, it's got an existing challenge of the wastewater from the local town of Dragoman that is pumped into the edge of this lake or wetland. So there's both a positive and a negative there. I mean, currently it is providing a service, but isn't necessarily recognized. It's providing a free water treatment service. So if that can be standardized and at least incentivized through that local water utility, then there's a big opportunity here. The other is through tourism, because it is quite close to the capital, Sofia, and is already visited by quite a number of people, certainly once a year for a large sporting event there. But there's huge potential for nature tourism here as well. So they recently had breeding cranes on this site for the first time in hundreds of years. And with a little bit of work, whether it's reed removal or the re-establishment of the boardwalk there, there's real potential for this to take off. And again, support the economy locally while also demonstrating the value of the wetland. Okay, getting into the 4 pillars, if you recall: ecology, community, governance, and finance. And we'll delve into this a little bit in terms of the technical stuff we've achieved thus far. The first is we have identified 22 SMART indicators for wetland resilience and the services provided from them. SMART, for those of you who don't know, it's specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound. And that's very important because a huge number of national strategies are not SMART. They have these ephemeral targets that are aspirational in nature, using lots of action verbs like aspire to and help to achieve towards, which ironically hinders you from achieving them. And then the second part of this thus far has been identifying and elucidating some of the functional relationships around wetlands. And as you would imagine, water table depth is so important, but not only in terms of the global warming potential of these areas, but also in terms of the biodiversity, whether it's bacterial diversity or some of the other services. And it's good to see those solidly on a graph. A lot of this data has been mined from publicly available sources through some very fancy computer wizardry that I don't understand. In terms of community engagement, so we have looked at our knowledge sites. Again, if you think about the knowledge, action, legacy triad, we analysed those for existing community engagement practices. Now we're in the process of looking at our action sites. So we've run through a stakeholder mapping process for each one of our 6 action sites. And we're now looking at the socioeconomics of these sites, in particular around what are known as participatory multi-criteria analysis, to both help guide the restoration and also engage with community actors locally. Community, more broadly speaking, I suppose, are stakeholders. And then also more basically, where PMCA is not possible, looking at cost-benefit analysis of these particular areas. In terms of governance, we have completed a governance analysis of the knowledge sites in our network, and are now building a roadmap for idealized policy and governance structures at our action sites. So we have gone through identifying 4 different theoretical governance frameworks. You can read them on the screen there. And then also, quite interestingly, is that we've looked at some of the 6 benefits of good governance for wetlands. So in other words, why would you do this? And again, I won't go through these, but they're all on our publicly available deliverable. So gaining legitimacy, providing direction, being accountable, quite important stuff that we often don't acknowledge or certainly write down. We're also in the midst of an in-depth investigation of action sites in terms of what existing governance exists there, how functional it is, what needs to change. Quite important and not often analysed. Again, coming back to that point, that oftentimes it's the ecology that is the dominant approach, and it's supported by other bits and pieces. What we're doing is ensuring from a very early stage that all 4 of those core pillars are both mutually supportive but also equal in attention. Moving on to finance. So we're going to focus on 3 of our sites thus far. The first is the Netherlands, Eames-Dullard. Like I said, a project to raise and re-wet the land locally and soften that edge. What we have done there, first of all, is presented a concept for funding based on carbon, biodiversity credits, and regenerative agriculture. We've got huge experience in our consortium both in the Netherlands and globally through the Landscape Finance Lab. And as I said, engagement with those farmers is crucial, because without that support, as we've seen with various other recent elections across Europe, there can be strong pushback and then failure of some of the policies. In the UK, like I said, the Great North Bog previously, we now have a call for expressions of interest out for investment in this area. We are hiring a green finance coordinator through the University of Leeds, and again, massive carbon expertise from the Landscape Finance Lab. And then in Ireland, popping along here, sorry, we've taken a few significant leaps forward. So we have now established a separate entity called Peatland Finance Ireland, which is an aligned project that has the support of the European Investment Bank and our own National Parks and Wildlife Service, but more recently, some strong philanthropic support that has allowed us to develop things like our Peatland Standard, which ultimately aims to bundle ecosystem services and then present that as an investable proposition. Because we've quite quickly realized that carbon on its own will not pay for this work. Water on its own will not pay for this work, certainly with increased costs of these actions. So a bundling, a combination, not simply a stacking, but we believe a bundling of this is the way forward, especially if you can get that key piece for biodiversity and that key piece for social uplift, or at least impact. And again, I could talk for hours on Peatland Finance Ireland. And the last two interesting pieces of our work, which I don't often highlight, but I really should, because certainly one helped us push the application through, I believe. The first is our artistic network. And this was a small part of the project, but it is gaining so much traction and so much interest that it's really taken on a life of its own. So we went out to the artistic world looking for 6 artists, 1 per site, to do a small artistic engagement on these sites. The idea was to encourage scientists and practitioners to see in a different way, to engage with local communities in a non-scientific way, mobilize stakeholders, and provide this kind of common community engaged response to restoration. Again, we were looking for 6. We advertised it and we got 500 applications across the world. We had some from Australia and San Fran and elsewhere. And these were not art students, recent graduates. These were folks who had exhibited in some of the largest galleries in the world, award-winning artists, in particular, culturally engaged, in some cases, community-embedded artists, which is exactly what we were looking for. So a really strong response. We now have 7 artists, there's a pair in the UK, who have done some phenomenal work already, whether it's designing board games for use by children in Venice, whether it's putting on a formal exhibition in the National Gallery in Sofia. So there's Maria in the bottom left with some of her work, and then huge amounts of initial exploratory work. The value, I suppose, of our artists or of our offering to artists was the longevity of what we were offering. So it was only a month's worth of time we were giving them, but across 4 years. Because oftentimes artistic residencies go for 3 months across a summer, or maybe 6 months if you're lucky. And artists have communicated that that's really not long enough, certainly in terms of restoration, to both engage and then to see the change post-restoration. So our 4-year project with these artists allows them to engage every single year to keep up their day jobs or multiple jobs, and then to see that progression and then respond to that. So this will ultimately culminate in a joint exhibition in Venice in November 26th, and who knows, maybe even aligned with the Biennale there. And then the last piece that I wanted to cover here was the citizen science work that we're doing. So we've got 3 site-based pilots now underway, so Northern England and Yorkshire, Venice and Parnu. The whole idea of this, reasonably similar to the art, but in different ways, is first of all to collect data. So actually having people out in the wilds collecting data for you, whether it's water table depth or vegetation. It's to stimulate action. Again, that could be young people and old, and we have both of those, and everyone in between, to broaden interest. So to demystify it all and bring it down to what is the real level, what isn't the ivory tower I talked about earlier. And also, I suppose, through those previous 3 is to embed this in legacy. So to ensure that it is the norm, that engaging with people and showing that value and respectfully engaging with all stakeholders is as important, if not more, than the ecological graph you get on a good R squared. The last point, just to reiterate, that we are clustered with our 3 other projects, so MERLIN, West Coast and Superb. So much so that in 2 weeks' time, we're having a joint General Assembly with our West Coast colleagues in Groningen in the Netherlands, which will be a exciting, if not a massive event, which I'm really looking forward to. But we continue to engage. We have published papers together. We have designed maps and have held advocacy workshops in Brussels together, and it will build and build hopefully over the next few years. I'll stop for Míle maith agaibh go léir, and I'm happy to take any questions. So I'll stop there. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Shane. A very clear presentation. I've already seen a lot of comments to that effect in the chat. People have put several questions in the chat, and if you have more questions, feel free at any time to pose those questions right now through. We have another 25 minutes officially. Sometimes we go over. So I'll start with the first question. From Fabio, the first question is, thanks for an interesting presentation. How are you quantifying the water-related ecosystem services?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question. Thanks, Fabio. So there is no national standard for this. There's certainly not an international standard. And this is where the private sector have really led the way. Ostensibly, what you're looking at is volumetric water benefit. And in peatlands, that's quite easy to do, certainly in terrestrial wetlands, because the water runs off it or through it. With coastal systems, it's a lot trickier, but nevertheless not impossible. So as an example, in peatlands in Ireland, we have piezometers and flumes established in some of our peatland areas, which is measuring both the water table depth in certain areas, but then ultimately with a flume at the bottom of that is measuring the amount of water running off that hillside. That's very clearly quantified, both pre and post restoration. And you can see the reduction in flashiness of that flow. And from a corporate perspective, certainly there are those interested in paying for a reduction in that because it reduces the risk in terms of flooding, but also very clearly demonstrates that you are contributing to water positivity in the area. So yeah, there's no national standard. We would love there to be one, similar to carbon or closer to carbon. But in the interim, we're going to need to work with the private sector to move towards having a national standard for that. Thank you.
The second question is from Jose Luis Moutinho, and that is, are these, it was right in the middle, I couldn't catch, you mentioned some reports. He said, are these reports available on the web? Could you please share the links?
Yeah. So depending on the nature of the deliverable, as you would imagine, some are public and some are confidential. There's a couple that are still under review but are public. So anything that is available is on our website, waterlands.eu, and go to the results page. You'll find both the deliverables and also some interesting articles on our artistic engagement. Yeah, some interesting stuff in there too. But it's all, if it's publicly available, it's up there.
Okay, the next is from Alejandro Dusayan. Great work, Shane, on citizen science. Can you expand a bit on how you ensured proper training so as to reduce uncertainties, for example, for sampling, measuring, reporting, across the citizen science groups and sites?
Yeah, it's a tricky one, isn't it? Because you're relying on non-experts to collect what could become expert data. This is where our local universities are coming in. So on our sites, we don't yet have the system in place to submit the data, but we're now starting to collect that data. So the local university, for example, in Tartu, we've now linked the public initiatives up with academics in institutions, and they're being trained in how to objectively collect and submit that. Elsewhere, it is guided by researchers. So in the north of England, in Yorkshire, there's really interesting coring work being done. So looking at the palynology of these areas, so taking cores and then getting communities to assess those cores. Again, I'm not an expert on this. So on or in person, I suppose. So I guess you have half a dozen publicly recruited research assistants in the field with you. I'm going to add to that, actually, sorry. And then in Italy, it's largely children-based and schools-based, and we have engaged with the Natural History Museum in Venice to run workshops where they go out on boats every summer and record the quality of the wetland. We're now up to 300 children every year, and in all likelihood, or certainly with aspiration, to embed that in local curricula as well, to, again, ensure that legacy lives beyond waterlands.
Okay, the next question is from Joshua Royd of the Nature Conservancy. Fantastic, Shane. This work is so rich, too much to absorb in one webinar, pun intended. But together with Merlin, there could really be a full year class on lessons learned and how to and maybe how not to change the multiple scales. Question for both projects then. How do you ensure knowledge is dispersed, not just uploaded on a website to find?
Yeah, and this is why I was embarrassed to say that yes, they're on the website, because most of those documents are quite technical, although they're public. Absorbing those is quite tricky, if not impossible, to the wider audience. So we have now started to design or to insist from the deliverable producers a video associated with them, and then also a non-technical report, especially associated with those reports that would be otherwise very technical. So they will also be uploaded. But then the other part of that is to ensure that it goes directly to the ground. So what we don't want to become is a deliverable factory and do our 5 years and pump out our 17 deliverables, and for that to be done. Many more than 17, actually. So for each one of our deliverables, as it is produced, we go straight to our restoration sites and ask, how can you engage with this? How can you implement this on the ground? What piece of your puzzle does this fill? And if it doesn't, then reflect back on the original producer of that to say, how can we plug that gap? Do we need more community work? Do we need to look at this water table graph a bit more? And it's not going to be ubiquitously useful. I mean, frustratingly enough, waterlands or wetlands are not the same. We've got 6 quite different wetlands. So communicating that effectively is going to need to be done at a local level. Coming from one office in Dublin is a little presumptuous.
The next question is from Alejandro Dusayan. Shane, can you expand on water positivity, quote unquote?
Yeah. So water storage, largely speaking. Again, this comes back to VWB, volumetric water benefit, but also the quality of that water. So whether it's dissolved organic carbon or suspended material, you slow the flow, there is less of that. Now, obviously not none. So water positivity in terms of reduced flow, increased storage, and reduced cost of treatment. And there are water boards involved with that. So I mentioned the Yorkshire Water, but also in Ireland, our semi-state utility called Uisce Éireann. There's now much stronger attention on this, because although it's nice to have, we're now starting to quantify the tangible economic offset of keeping that water up there, or at least slowing it coming down. So I suppose water positivity is using a corporate term that's often used in their own reporting. And this is the trick with languages and with dictionaries, that we have a scientific level of certainty and a scientific term we used versus a corporate timescale that looks for a report for a board in 6 weeks' time. So definitions of certainty and definitions, generally speaking, I think both need to be softened to find a happy medium that we can move forward with.
The next question is from Holger Schmidt of Nature Finance. Do you measure biodiversity uplift, and are you using any of the emerging biodiversity credit methodologies?
Yeah, it's seen as the panacea, right? That silver bullet, if you can just get that last piece. And there are many emerging. We're looking at various. I mean, Biodiversity Credit Alliance provided some nice guidance on this. Wellacea Trust. There's also Vera and Gold Standard looking at this direction as well. The trick with wetlands is that although they are very diverse, the response to restoration is much slower than it would be for, let's say, tropical rainforest. I mean, your 1% biodiversity uplift could probably be achieved with 1 meter square of tropical rainforest. Whereas with Irish peatland, you probably need about 1 hectare. So the scale is different and the time scale is different. And that's a challenge to overcome in terms of marketing that, or at least quantifying that. Also, the level of diversity would be much lower. The ability to quantify that would be more challenging, because you're looking at smaller taxa, fauna and flora, and others. So whether you look at individual indicator species that dictate a broader potential for diversity, or you wait those 5-10 years for the hen harrier to start nesting again, or the dragonfly population to increase. Like I said, look at an indicator species, maybe a testate amoeba in the water column. But we have a PhD student looking at invertebrate, or specifically arachnid diversity as an indicator for biodiversity uplift in the longer term. But it is not simple. I really wish that there was a single standard. To note, we're also engaging with DG Environments on this to see if we can help develop that, because there is conversation, and in the same way that the carbon removal certification framework is coming down the tracks, I wouldn't be surprised if something similar for biodiversity and the need for water, coming back to Alessandro's point, isn't too far behind.
Yeah, it's pretty tough when your economic, political, and ecological cycles are out of phase and at different scales. Mark Day has the next question. Excellent presentation, impressive and insightful. My question is, what approach and at whose cost did you use to bring together diverse partners from across Europe to enable this impressive proposal to be developed?
If you're a European citizen, your cost. So thank you very much. Fully funded by the European Commission. Initially, anyway. We're now starting to gain quite a bit of interest in co-funding. But ultimately, we have been funded by, I was about to say 100% funded, but we are 97% funded, because we do have some co-funding from some of our corporate partners. And as I said, 23 million, although large, is nowhere near what we need to do. In fact, most of the investors we're speaking to won't get out of bed for that money. You're looking at nine-figure sums. And finding someone to hold that funding to enable all of these wheels to turn is actually quite a tricky bit. Because you'll need state structures in place, really, for that scale. And in order to get state backing for this, you need to do a lot of long-term soft engagement to justify yourself, to prove the concept, which is, again, a bit chicken and egg. How do you prove that concept at large scale without the funding to do it at large scale? So in Ireland, for example, we've got 4 different pilots within Peatland Finance Ireland, looking at forestry, post-peat extraction, the water that I mentioned earlier, and then also the wider community, which looks at the Culca and Éireann SAC. And all of those pieces individually are very important, but scalability-wise, there's only a few of those that can be scaled up and demonstrate that 200 million euro investment, which is what we need. So at the moment, it is quite top-down in terms of funding model, which is likely how it is going to remain for the short term until we can demonstrate tangible returns on a returns-based basis, whether it's concessional finance or proper investable finance, I suppose, in the medium term and hopefully long term.
Next question is from Isabel Lentz. Dear Shane, thank you for great work and presentation. Could you expand further on how the ecosystem bundle approach works and how it has been developed at Peatland Finance Ireland?
Yeah, again, this is a different hat that I wear, but I could speak for hours on this. Basically speaking, what you're looking at is individual quantifications combined, which are then greater than the sum of their parts. And that's basically then to a story. So if you look at Dutch and German models around this, they can get 50, 70 euro a ton, ostensibly for carbon, but because of the wider story associated with it, most of which hasn't been quantified yet, but investors know that it is associated with that, and they can potentially even report on that, versus the likes of the UK, where prices are still 15, 20 pounds a ton and aren't yet rising because they don't currently offer that blended nature. Now, work ongoing on that, and it will come. But I guess with that singular large scale, you maybe dilute the market a little bit too, and you get hedging of those. Well, not hedging, but people are holding off and not investing in that or not entering the scheme because the prices are so low. So what we're looking at doing is creating that story, either through existing or schemes that we're designing to provide that monitoring, reporting, and verification, which is a Peatland standard, but also indicating that there's clear trajectory towards water and biodiversity quantification, and that combined, especially through the likes of a results-based system, there is social support there as well. It maintains rural communities, it supports, let's say, ecotourism, or feeds into the general just transition trajectory as well of areas in Ireland, for example, which are post-peat mining, and there's entire communities there that have lost out. The other aspect to this, just before I move on, is looking at risk, because especially with upland wetlands, you're looking at fire risk and flood risk. And figures can be put on those. Now, that's a longer process and you need to get into actuarial studies for that. But there is a lot of interest from the insurance market, certainly in Ireland, and from our semi-states that spend millions every year building flood defences. Similarly, in Venice, where millions have already been spent on the MOSA flood barrier system, and it can be demonstrated that that money can be saved by investing in that softer, literally wetland. Now, euro to euro is much trickier.
Well, that's great to hear, Ted. It's nice that you're confirming the professionals I know that are designing role-playing games for the World Bank increasingly say of 20 years experience that it's just what the stories you're telling, that they have to get to that. The next question, Eva Hernandez of the WWF. Great session, Shane. I'm curious to know how you are progressing with cap measures. Are farmers collaborating? And are the recent sector protests getting in your way?
Hello, Eva. Good to see you or hear you. In Ireland, it's a funny one. Because we've got such a strong lobby for so many years, the systems that have been designed in Ireland are very supportive of farmers. Now, I'm sure some would argue against that, but our results-based payment schemes have not done well for the last number of years, and therefore we've learned a lot of hard lessons in this. One lesson is that broad and shallow approaches, like our previous GLOS scheme, don't have any effect environmentally. So they need to be focused on specific areas, and the incentivization needs to be real. It needs to be enough to offset those opportunity costs of fencing in a land or reducing your headage on an area. So we've learned hard lessons. If you, for example, you look at the nature restoration law and the recent votes, this time last year when the Commission and then the Parliament voted for the first time, all of our 13 MEPs from Ireland voted in favour of the nature restoration law. More recently, we did lose 3 of those, but nowhere near the kind of attrition that other states had in terms of support. So we do a good job of supporting our agricultural community in Ireland. Again, some would argue against that, but largely speaking, that lobby has been so strong for so long that the results-based schemes that are now coming in are doing a good job, finally. Ironically, this has not learned lessons from the state. It has learned lessons from community-led organisations, right back from a programme called the Burren 20 years ago in Ireland. And it has been slowly integrated through various elements into the way we do farming in Ireland. Now, still massively impactful. I mean, our dairy and beef sector is hugely impactful environmentally. But if we can tangibly demonstrate benefit, monetary benefit, then I think the rest does follow. Ironically, we've engaged with our Bulgarian partners to try and share knowledge across that, and we quite quickly realised that the Bulgarians, or the Bulgarian system is where we were 20 years ago, in that there is no results-based schemes. The Department of Agriculture and the Department of the Environment are anathema to each other and don't talk. So we asked, what's the baseline for results-based payments there? And it's kind of head scratching. What do you mean? So I think there's huge potential for us to impart some of our knowledge, and vice versa for other elements as well. I mean, by no means are we perfect in Ireland.
The next question is from Willem Bouw. Thanks for the presentation, Shane. What is the way forward of WaterLANDS when the project has been completed? Are initiatives related to taking your results for upscaling restoration already taking off?
Yeah, again, looking at the Peatland Finance Ireland initiative, that is open-ended and it's attracting more and more attention. In fact, we've now got memoranda of understanding with several government departments here in Ireland. The intention is to potentially even embed that in government policy. Certainly, or hopefully as an aligned entity, maybe even an executive agency here in Ireland. And that will most certainly go long term. In other jurisdictions, it is already built into some long-term projects. So Eames Dollard is part of the ED 2050 program, which is looking at mobilizing that finance that can do much, much greater things across the entire estuary, and not simply a double dike here and a soft green one here, and a sediment capture area here. In other areas, it requires, I think, pragmatic approaches in terms of, let's say, forestry and peat mining. Estonia, I'm alluding to there, because more recent pressures have shown that policies change quite quickly. So you need to ensure that you're being as objective as possible, and that you're being that forefront. You're showing that you are the holders of the most recent information, and that there is not the impact you presume there will be. Coming back to the longevity piece, I mean, yes, WaterLANDS is there, but there's no reason why there can't be a WaterLANDS Plus. There's no reason why it can't butt off and ensure that it's not necessarily a WaterLANDS initiative, but that we have established the conditions in those 6 different locations for other initiatives to take root and to grow. And not that we're looking for a WaterLANDS stamp on it, but we can certainly step back and say, that was us. Yeah.
Next question from Jose Luis Montinho. I'm coordinating the Mission Ocean and Waters Blue Mission project. The results of your project, as well as Merlin's, are completely in line with Mission Objective 1, which is to restore marine and freshwater systems. Are you somehow connected with the Mission Ocean and Waters? How can we collaborate in the near future to boost your results?
Yeah, so Plan Bleu is probably the most prominent partner that we have in this, and they are engaged with that. So they have a UNEP mandate to do exactly that for the Mediterranean. And we've got some good traction on that. I mean, they ran a side session at the recent COP, and they're quite heavily engaged. The other side of that is Wetlands International, and especially their European Association, who have a permanent representation in Brussels, and they do a fantastic job of that softer diplomacy that's required for this. And for sure, it will be linked in with the mission that you proposed. Given the scale of the investment of these 4 projects and the prescience of the development of, let's say, the nature restoration law, we are in a very strong position to be, I guess, lighthouses for how restoration can be done properly in an objective and hopefully community embedded way. But we're well positioned, yeah.
The next question from Richard Ford of Karen Gorham's Connect. Are you seeing any flexibility in terms of management of designations to allow these restorative works to be delivered? I ask because designations are a real headache for me in Scotland.
Yeah, completely agree. There's nothing worse than a red line on a map, right? And that's one of the themes that come out of farmer engagement sessions or training sessions, is this fear of designation. I mean, they already lie within an SAC, which already brings some level of restriction, and they're fearful of either that expanding or of, God forbid, it becoming a national park. Ideally, and this was a fantastic response, we had a visioning workshop at the start of this process where we asked people what they see as the output of this. And we had restoration practitioners, people from National Park Services, putting up their hands saying, the best outcome for this is for my job to be obsolete in X number of years, in that I shouldn't need to exist. The line on that map shouldn't need to be there. So what we're aspiring to do is ironically get rid of that designation, because we've actively incentivized it, whether it's economically or socially, culturally, spiritually as well. But it is, I wouldn't say it's a headache. It's an element of the discussion. Not that it has completely halted the discussions in some areas, but it does need to be respected, and the tangible fears of that do need to be listened to. Again, walk in their shoes, etc. Yeah.
The next question from Alejandro Dusayan. Great work, Shane, on citizen science. Can you expand a bit on how you ensured proper training so as to reduce uncertainties? For example, sampling, measuring, reporting across the groups, across
I don't think we got that one already, did we? They might
Oh,
have got
yeah,
that
I
one
think
already,
so.
I'm
I'm
not sure.
sorry, I must have copied it twice. Finally, then, Anne Kaiser, how well your project has managed to engage peat companies to restore their sites. Have you success?
Yeah, well, one of them is a proper partner on the so Tutsi Turbas is a partner, and they're looking at some of their sites now, and they're not exactly post peat extraction because there was still peat there. So as of last year, they were actually leveling out some of the piles of peat that would ordinarily have been sold, and they're spreading it back onto the land to start re-establishing the hydrology. Um, Not to say that that has been ubiquitous. We have strong buy-in from our own Irish company called Bord na Móna, semi-state entity for peat mining. Um, they have a mandate to remediate to basic ecological function, but they've also now got quite a bit of funding through recovery and resilience to do what's called enhanced rehabilitation across quite a large tract of their land. Um, Now, they are a commercial entity. We need to respect that they are mandated to generate a profit. Um, so they are looking at wind energy, solar, all kinds of other novel engagements of their land. Um, and there's no reason why that can't also be part of why carbon, water, biodiversity can't also be part of that reframing of their land. The last thing we should be doing with companies like that is presuming we know best and excluding them from these conversations. Of all stakeholders, they are some of the most important because they hold the keys to the gates, literally, and also have the potential to feed in quite significant amounts of investment.
I was about to close everything off, and then another question just popped in from Maureen. Thanks for the presentation. How do you expect to deal with the situation where you have multiple owners within a peatland to be restored? Situations like in Bulgaria are very common in Finland, for example.
Yeah, interesting one. And I'm aware of that in Finland too. Um, Estonia isn't too dissimilar, and certainly Ireland and to the north of England as well. So commonage, hazy ownership, hazy usage. Sometimes you can't even find the person. They might be living in Canada now and forgot that they even had the deed. Um, Specifically in Ireland, a lot of our land ownership maps were burnt in the 1920s, so we simply will never know who owns it. Um, and this is where the ecologists come in because they're able to advise us now that changing the water table does not adversely affect the vegetation on that area, and therefore it doesn't adversely impact the use of that commonage. And that, legally speaking, is the important hurdle there, because you don't therefore need the agreement of everybody on that land. You just need a proportion of that because you can clearly demonstrate that it isn't having an impact on the commonage. Therefore, you don't need 100% buy-in. It's not like all in or none in. It's most in because we know we're not having an impact. If anything, we're having a positive because we're generating I wouldn't say an economic return, but certainly we are keeping value in the land.
Well, we are 2 minutes over officially, so timing is brilliant. Everyone, I've seen many comments. Everyone is very pleased. Thank you very much for excellent presentation and commentary. Astrid, I believe we have the next webinar coming first week of May.
Yeah, right. The next webinar will be on May 6th, and it will be held by Leonard Sandin from NINA, and he will talk about nature-based solutions and working with nature-based solutions. Leonard, do you want to say something to that?
I can say very shortly that I will summarize. I led several Nordic funded projects on nature-based solutions and how to implement them in the Nordics, looking at everything from laws to research and what's being done and the planning for the future. So that's what I will be talking about. Thank you.
Thanks. It will be on the 6th of May at 3 p.m. as always.
Great. Well, I think then that's everything. As you know, this is a recorded session. If you want to review it, you can see it. I believe it'll be uploaded to the web to the site within a week or so. And so again, thanks very much, Shane, and best to everybody. We'll see you all then on the 6th of May.
Thank you very much, folks.
Thanks also from my side, Jane. Thank you.